Hello, welcome to this short introduction to Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound can be described as one of the most eccentric poets in modernist American literature, a trait he can said to be shared with others like E. Cummings. Ezra Pound was born in 1885 at Hailey in Idaho. He studied in a series of private schools. Some of them were run by Quakers, and then later he moved on to a school which was actually a military academy. Early in childhood, Pound distinguished himself as clever, independent, eccentric, and unpopular, traits which would certainly shed some light on his poetry. Pound, of course, showed some promise as a poet early in life. Pound was also quite a scholar early in life and is said to have learned as many as 9 languages. But his was not a conventional scholar's interest. So he flitted from college to college quite often, one might say. His affair with Hilda Doolittle was a failure, but his association with her turned out to be a good thing for modernist poetry. H.D., as Hilda came to be known, became a poet in her own right. Pound had an early visit to Europe with his aunt when he was 13. He made another at the age of 21 with a grant he got from his college. Both visits turned out to be very productive for his poetry. Pound's first volume of poems was published in 1908. Although it did not sell much, a London daily, one of the more popular ones, described it as wild, haunting stuff, absolutely poetic, original, and imaginative. This happened when he was in London. He continued to live in London till 1920. Meanwhile, he had married Dorothy, the novelist Olivia Shakespeare's daughter, in 1940. Pound, Hilda, and her husband Richard Addington formed a creative threesome who together did much to popularize the new modernist poetry, especially the imagist variety. Pound's interest in Chinese and Japanese poetry developed during his London days when he was a regular visitor to the London Museum. The papers of Ernest Fenollosa, who was a teacher in Japan, turned Pound's interest towards Chinese and Japanese poetry. In fact, the economy, the strict conventions, and the imagist slant of much of traditional Chinese and Japanese poetry were to become decisive influences in Pound's poetic career. The principles of poetic creation, which were to become central to Pound's poetry, were contemplated and developed during this time. Pound considered direct treatment as the most important technique. He was for strict economy, the avoidance of all superfluous expressions, and his essential principles were precision, clarity, and rational thinking. He was against all forms of romanticism, abstraction, and rhetoric. Pound's principles of poetic creation are perhaps epitomized in his famous 2-line poem, In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of those faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Meanwhile, Pound had become mentor and patron to a number of British and American writers and poets of the new modernist school, who included Eliot, Joyce, Amy Lowell, E. Cummings, and Ernest Hemingway. Eliot's Wasteland is dedicated to Pound. Pound had become an unofficial minister of culture in his time. The Pounds moved to Paris in 1921, but dissatisfied with life in Paris after 3 years there, they left for Italy. Life in Italy for the next 20 years were to become decisive in Pound's life and career. Most of Pound's famous cantos were written after he moved to Italy. The critic Alan Tate's statement that Pound is incapable of sustained thought and was at the mercy of random flights of angelic insight and self-indulgences of prejudices seems to be borne out by several of the cantos. The cantos appeared in several volumes from 1917 to 1968. Living in Italy and ruminating over the First World War, which had greatly disillusioned him, Pound's thinking soon latched on to fascism as a solution for the problems of capitalism as it existed then, and which Pound had diagnosed as the cause for the First World War. He met Mussolini in 1933 against the advice of many of his friends and well-wishers. Although Mussolini had a good word for Pound's poems, he was not impressed by Pound's versions on contemporary economic thinking. Pound's allegiance to the Italy-Germany axis became more pronounced when he travelled to New York in 1939 in what he thought was a good attempt to prevent American involvement in the Second World War. Soon, Pound began to write anti-Jewish articles for the Italian press. He also broadcast over the Italian radio. Both the articles and the broadcasts continued till his arrest by the Allied forces in 1945 at the very end of the Second World War. Pound showed signs of insanity after he was arrested. After an inquiry and trial, Pound was committed to a mental asylum, where he remained for the next 12 years. Pound continued to write in his asylum, but his output was much reduced. Although he had publicly disowned his anti-Jewish politics, it continued to be his creed in private life. His association with far-right, fascist and racist activists continued to create controversies. After a long campaign by writers and friends, Pound was released in 1958. Soon he arrived in Naples, Italy, where he made statements attacking American society to the press. A bout of depression struck him. He made things worse for him by attending a fascist May Day parade in 1962. Bereaved by the death of two of his closest friends, William Carlos Williams in 1963 and Eliot in 1964, Pound pulled on till 1972 when he died at the age of 87. Pound's contributions to modernist poetry in English are generally well acknowledged. His innovations in poetic form have left a lasting legacy. Pound has probably no equal in the construction of a poetic image, perhaps also in his precision of language. Some of his poems best embody the typical anti-romanticism of much of modernist poetry. Pound's translations are also of vital interest for modernism. Many of his translations were in fact free renderings or rewritings which merely launched from the original, the most remarkable of which was the Old English poem Seafarer. Pound is also responsible for popularizing the haiku of Japanese poetry. Pound, in his self-proclaimed role of an arbiter of literary taste, was responsible for advancing the career of a number of his contemporaries, including Eliot, Joyce, Marianne Moore, Hemingway, Frost, and Williams. Pound has been accused of being too literary or formal. Philip Larkin put it precisely when he said that Pound thought that poetry could be made from poetry and not out of being alive. Unlike Eliot, Pound showed little concern for what was happening in his society, uh, especially at a time when Western civilization was generally considered to be in a state of crisis. What he did say about society and politics outside his poetry, unfortunately, were far from being politically correct. The Ballad of the Goodly Fair is a revisionist rereading of the life and image of Jesus Christ. The traditional construction of Jesus as meek, ascetic, and withdrawn from life is deconstructed in the poem, which is narrated by one of Jesus' associates. Jesus is pictured as a life-loving man, resolute, determined, and undaunted in the face of threats to his life. His wrath of righteous indignation is seen in the way he whipped the gamblers and prostitutes at the temple. He was loyal to his friends and disciples and protected them. Though he worked miracles like making the blind see and the lame walk, the greatest miracle was the way he faced his crucifixion bravely. The narrator says that the soldiers who crucified him are fools to imagine that they have killed Jesus. Like faithful Christians world over, he believes that Jesus has come back from the dead, for he believes he saw Jesus eating honeycomb. On the other hand, he also seems to say that Jesus' enemies have not been able to destroy either his memory or his legacy.